When you think of the British Empire, what comes to mind? For many, it's railways and laws. It's an institution that casts a long, proud shadow over world history. It's remembered for spreading parliamentary democracy, for the English language, for grand architecture that still stands in capitals across the globe. The British Empire is, in short, remembered for building things. But what if the price of those railways was the destruction of a people? What if the foundation of those laws was the explicit denial of the humanity of an entire continent? Because in Australia, the arrival of the British didn't start with construction. It started with a brutal, systematic, and until very recently, a largely unacknowledged campaign of destruction. A campaign that saw entire nations erased, cultures shattered, and a people pushed to the very edge of extinction. This isn't a story of glorious imperial expansion. This is the story of the side of the empire you were never meant to see. The story begins with a lie, a single, foundational lie that would justify everything that came after. When Captain James Cook sailed into Botany Bay in 1770, he looked upon a continent that was home to over 500 distinct nations, a mosaic of languages, laws, and cultures stretching back at least 65,000 years. He saw smoke from campfires, he saw people on the shores, he even interacted with them. And yet, he and the empire that followed him chose to declare this land Terra Nullius. It's a Latin term, and it means land belonging to no one. That declaration, that devastating legal fiction, was the masterstroke. It framed Australia not as an inhabited land to be negotiated with, or even conquered, but as an empty wasteland, free for the taking. In a single gesture, it rendered the entire Aboriginal population invisible in the eyes of British law. They weren't citizens. They weren't even enemies. They were flora and fauna, just another feature of the landscape to be cleared, like the bush, to make way for sheep and settlements. This is the story of the massacres, the biological warfare, and the stolen children that defined the colonisation of a continent, a story some have called Australia's secret and forgotten Holocaust. On the 26th of January 1788, the First Fleet, 11 ships packed with convicts, marines and officials, anchored in what is now Sydney Harbour. This date, now celebrated controversially as Australia Day, marked the permanent beginning of the British colony. It was called a settlement, but for the people who already lived there, it was nothing short of an invasion. The idea of Terra Nullius wasn't just a passive concept, it was an active tool for stealing land. Under 18th century European law, there were 3 ways to claim foreign territory: occupy a truly uninhabited land, negotiate a treaty and buy the land, or conquer the existing people. The British did none of these. They just pretended the first one was true, ignoring the hundreds of thousands of people whose home this was. This was officially locked into Australian law with Governor Richard Bourke's 1835 proclamation, which retroactively legalised all the land seizures that were already happening. This legal trick meant that when Aboriginal nations resisted, they weren't seen as a sovereign people defending their homeland. When they speared sheep that were destroying their hunting grounds, or defended sacred sites from being destroyed, these weren't seen as acts of war. They were framed as criminal atrocities, savage, unprovoked attacks. And that crucial distinction, born from the lie of Terra Nullius, gave the moral and legal green light for the wave of horrific violence that was about to be unleashed. The resistance was immediate and fierce. A Bidjigal man named Pemulwuy led a 12-year guerrilla war against the British. In Western Australia, a Noongar leader named Yagan became a wanted man for fighting back. These men, and countless others, were not criminals. They were warriors fighting a defensive war against an invading force. But colonial records paint them as little more than pests, as their resistance was used as justification for even more brutal reprisals. To make all of this easier, a deep and poisonous racism was encouraged. Colonial newspapers, settler diaries, and official letters are filled with descriptions of Aboriginal people as subhuman, intellectually inferior, morally bankrupt, and incapable of improving the land. This dehumanization was essential. It's far easier to kill a pest than it is to kill a person. It's easier to steal land from a savage than from its rightful owner. This wasn't just the prejudice of a few ignorant people. It was an ideological pillar of the whole colonial project, a necessary step for the war of extermination that a magistrate at the time, Edward Denny Day, would later call it. The British government's first instructions to the governor had urged him to conciliate their affections and live in amity and kindness. But those lofty words, written thousands of miles away in London, meant absolutely nothing on the frontier. On the ground, all that mattered was the hunger for land and a legal system that gave violence a thumbs up. The stage was set, not for settlement, but for conquest by the most brutal means imaginable. The land had been declared empty, the people had been declared inhuman, and their resistance had been declared a crime. The killing times were about to begin. The period from the early 1800s to the late 1920s is known to many First Nations people as the Killing Times. It was an era defined by a relentless series of massacres that rolled across the continent right alongside the frontier. This wasn't random violence, it was a strategic, if often uncoordinated, campaign to clear the land of its original people. As of 2024, researchers have identified 417 documented massacre sites across Australia, resulting in the deaths of over 10,000 Aboriginal people, a number that keeps growing as more evidence comes to light. These weren't battles, they were the systemic slaughter of largely undefended men, women, and children. The methods were calculated and monstrously cruel. Settlers and police would attack camps at dawn when people were asleep and most vulnerable. They would hand out gifts of flour, sugar, and tobacco that they'd laced with arsenic or strychnine, a method that left little evidence. They poisoned waterholes, they drove people off cliffs, and in many cases, after the killing was done, they would build huge bonfires to burn the bodies, destroying the evidence of their crimes. While hundreds of these atrocities happened, a few have broken through the national silence, often because they were just so brutal that they just couldn't be ignored. One of the most infamous is the Myall Creek Massacre of 1838. That winter, a group of about 30 Wirrarae people were camped peacefully on a cattle station in New South Wales. They knew the station hands and had been offered the spot as a safe place. On June 10th, a gang of 12 armed stockmen rode in. They rounded up the Aboriginal group, mostly elderly men, women, and children, tied them together, and marched them into the bush, where they were brutally murdered. Their bodies were then decapitated and hacked apart, before being piled onto a fire. What makes Myall Creek unique isn't the massacre itself. Killings like this were horrifyingly common. But what happened next? Against all odds, the crime was reported. The governor ordered an investigation, and 11 of the 12 men were arrested. Their first trial ended in a swift acquittal, with cheers in the courtroom. But the Attorney General, John Plunkett, wouldn't let it go. He pushed for a second trial, this time focusing on the murder of a single Aboriginal child. 7 of the men were found guilty and hanged. The only time in Australian history that white settlers were executed for massacring Aboriginal people. The public backlash against the hangings was enormous. The powerful settler lobby argued that killing Aboriginal people wasn't a crime, it was just a necessary part of taking the land. Myall Creek was just a part of a wider wave of violence. Just months earlier, an expedition led by Major James Nunn resulted in the Waterloo Creek Massacre. After some stockmen were killed, Nunn and his troopers hunted a group of Gamilaraay people for weeks. They finally cornered them at a place now known as Slaughterhouse Creek. In the slaughter that followed, somewhere between 40 and 300 people were killed. Accounts described troopers shooting people out of trees like crows. There was an official inquiry, but no one was punished. In fact, Major Nunn became a hero to many settlers. The violence raged for decades. The last officially acknowledged massacre occurred in 1928 at Coniston Station in Central Australia. While the official death toll was 31, oral histories from Warlpiri and other communities suggested the true number exceeded 200. After a white dingo trapper was killed, a posse led by Mounted Constable William George Murray set out for revenge. For 2 months, they rode through the country, shooting any Warlpiri, Anmatyeri and Ktetye people they saw. The official inquiry recorded 31 deaths, but Aboriginal oral history suggests the real number was closer to 200. A board of inquiry cleared Constable Murray and his party of any wrongdoing. These events, Myall Creek, Waterloo Creek, Coniston, and the hundreds of others now being mapped by historians, were not isolated incidents. In 2024, the Frontier Massacres Research Project confirmed that over 10,000 Aboriginal people were killed in these and hundreds of other massacres across the continent. They were the face of a brutal, undeclared war that historians call the Frontier Wars. This conflict spanned 140 years and claimed the lives of tens of thousands of Aboriginal people, compared to maybe a few thousand colonists. It was a war fought not for territory, but for the very existence of the people on their own land. A war built on a lie, fought with rifles and poison, and then erased from the national story. The arsenal of colonisation wasn't just limited to guns and horses. The British Empire used a whole range of other weapons, some biological, some psychological, all of them devastating. Perhaps the deadliest weapon of all was the one settlers might not have even fully understood: disease. In April 1789, just 15 months after the First Fleet arrived, a catastrophic epidemic tore through the Aboriginal population around Sydney. The disease, identified by its symptoms as smallpox, was apocalyptic. With no prior exposure, Aboriginal people had no immunity. It's estimated the outbreak killed at least 50%, maybe even 70% of the local Eora population. Witnesses described coastlines littered with bodies, the terrified survivors trying to understand the invisible killer that was destroying their world. The origin of this epidemic is still hotly debated. There were no reported cases of smallpox on the First Fleet. This has led to a dark question. Was it deliberate? Some scholars argue that smallpox samples were brought on the fleet and intentionally released as an act of biological warfare. Others argue the disease likely arrived with Macassan traders in northern Australia and spread down through ancient trade routes. We may never know for sure, but for the people who died, the distinction was meaningless. The result was the same. Entire communities were wiped out, and the survivors were left weakened and demoralized, making them far easier to dispossess. A more clearly deliberate weapon was poison. The tactic of leaving poisoned flour for unsuspecting Aboriginal groups is documented in settler diaries and court records. Arsenic, a common ingredient in sheep dip, was readily available and easy to mix into food. The evil genius of this weapon was its deniability. Deaths from poisoned flour could be blamed on sickness, allowing the killers to escape justice, which they almost always did. It was a silent, cowardly form of massacre. The Empire also perfected the art of turning the colonized against themselves through the creation of the native police. These were paramilitary units of Aboriginal men, recruited from one region and then deployed in another, so they'd have no kinship ties to the people they were sent to control. Armed with rifles and swords and led by white officers, they became a brutally effective tool of colonial violence. The Queensland Native Mounted Police, in particular, became infamous and are now seen by historians as one of the most violent organisations in Australian history, responsible for dispersing, a euphemism for killing thousands of Aboriginal people. For the men who joined, it was often a choice between starving or surviving, but it came at the terrible cost of participating in the destruction of other First Nations groups. Beyond the physical violence, there was a war on the Aboriginal mind and soul, destroying sacred sites, desecrating burial grounds, violating cultural taboos. These weren't random acts of vandalism, they were targeted attacks on the spiritual heart of Aboriginal societies. Killing elders was a way to burn down libraries of cultural knowledge. But the most profound weapon of psychological destruction was the state-sanctioned policy of forcibly removing children from their families. This act, more than any other, was designed to break the chain of cultural transmission and ensure the eventual death of Aboriginal identity itself. If the Killing Times was a war on the Aboriginal body, the policy of child removal was the war on the Aboriginal soul. For over a century, from the late 1800s all the way up to the 1970s, Australian governments systematically and forcibly removed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, their communities, and their culture. These children are known today as the Stolen Generations. This wasn't a rogue policy, it was a state-sanctioned practice, driven by a racist ideology. The stated goal was assimilation. In the minds of men like A.O. Neville, the so-called chief protector of Aborigines in Western Australia, full-blood Aboriginal people were a dying race. The growing population of half-caste children, however, posed a problem for their vision of a white Australia. Their solution was to remove these children from their degenerate Aboriginal environment and raise them in white institutions. The explicit goal, repeated in official documents, was to breed out the colour over a few generations, to absorb them into white society until no trace of their Aboriginality was left. The methods were as heartless as the ideology. Children were snatched from their parents for simply being Aboriginal. They were taken from bush camps, from country towns, and even from hospital beds just after being born. Parents were told their children had died when they'd actually been taken. Siblings were deliberately separated to ensure their family bonds were completely shattered. In the institutions, they were often forbidden from speaking their native languages. They were taught to be ashamed of their heritage. Their names were changed. Their very identity was stolen. The trauma this inflicted is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine being a small child, ripped from your mother's arms, taken to a strange place, and told that everyone and everything you love is worthless. The children suffered horrific rates of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. They grew up without love, without family, and without a connection to their culture or their land. For the parents left behind, the grief was a wound that never healed. They spent their lives searching for their missing children. The removal of children tore the heart out of communities, destroying the lines of cultural knowledge that had been passed down for millennia. In 1995, the Australian government launched a national inquiry. Its final report, tabled in 1997, was called Bringing Them Home. It was a landmark document, filled with the gut-wrenching stories of over 500 members of the Stolen Generations. For the first time, the full, horrific scale of the policy was laid bare for all to see. The report called for reparations and a formal apology, but it also made another stark conclusion. It found that the policy of forcibly removing children with the intent to destroy a racial group fits the international legal definition of a particularly grave crime: genocide. The word Holocaust is powerful and confronting. The word genocide isn't just a description, it's a specific legal definition. Using these words in the context of Australian history forces a complete re-examination of the nation's founding story. So, let's take a look at the legal definition. The 1948 UN Genocide Convention defines genocide as any of 5 acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Let's go through them. A. Killing members of the group. The hundreds of documented massacres during the frontier wars, which targeted Aboriginal people just for being Aboriginal, clearly fit. B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm. The trauma of the massacres and the profound anguish of family separation clearly meets this threshold. C. Deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction. forcing people off their traditional lands and onto missions where disease and malnutrition were rampant is a direct fit. D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births. Policies aimed at controlling Aboriginal reproduction were a feature of the 20th century. E. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This is the most unambiguous charge. The Bringing Them Home report concluded that the forced removal of Aboriginal children met the UN definition of genocide. This finding was echoed again in 2024 by the Yoorrook Justice Commission in Victoria, which officially recognised colonisation as a genocidal process. The stated intent was the biological and cultural absorption of Aboriginal people until they ceased to exist as a distinct group. Given this, many legal scholars and historians argue that Australia's history is unequivocally one of genocide. From private genocides carried out by settlers in the 19th century to the state-sanctioned cultural genocide of the stolen generations, the pattern is clear. And yet, this conclusion remains fiercely contested in Australia. For decades, the nation clung to a story of peaceful settlement. The violence was downplayed as an unfortunate cost of progress, or the work of a few bad apples. This was what the anthropologist W.E.H. Stanner famously called the Great Australian Silence. The debate blew up in the 1990s, during the History Wars. After the High Court finally overturned Terra Nullius in 1992 and the Bringing Them Home report was released, a conservative backlash emerged. Commentators accused those who spoke of genocide of writing black armband history, of being unpatriotic. They argued there was no intent to destroy, only a misguided effort to civilize. They claimed the death tolls were inflated and that calling it genocide was an unfair comparison to the Nazi Holocaust. This isn't just an argument about the past, it goes to the very heart of Australia's identity today. To acknowledge genocide is to acknowledge that the modern Australian nation was built on a crime. It demands not just an apology, but justice and reparations. It challenges the very legitimacy of the entire colonial project. For some, refusing to accept the term is a continuation of the silence, a final attempt to forget the forgotten Holocaust. The story of the colonisation of Australia isn't over. The consequences of the massacres, the stolen land, and the stolen children are not historical footnotes. They are the lived reality for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. The trauma is intergenerational, passed down through families, shattered by centuries of violence. The statistics tell the grim story of this legacy. Indigenous Australians face staggering disadvantages in health, education, and employment. They are the most incarcerated people on the planet. This isn't because of individual failings. It is the direct, predictable outcome of a history of systemic destruction. But this is also a story of incredible survival. Against all odds, the world's oldest living cultures have endured. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to fight for justice, for recognition, and for their rightful place. The movement for treaties, for constitutional recognition, and for truth-telling is a testament to their unbreakable strength. Acknowledging the full truth isn't about guilt, it's about honesty. It's about understanding that the prosperity of modern Australia is built on a foundation of profound injustice. The term Holocaust is shocking, but it forces us to confront the true scale and intent of what happened. It forces us to ask, what is the right word for a campaign that seeks to eliminate a people, whether by a bullet or by a bureaucrat's pen? The forgotten Holocaust of Aboriginal Australia is a story that was deliberately erased. Now it is being reclaimed. It's being told in the voices of survivors, written in the research of courageous historians, and mapped on the blood-soaked soil of the continent itself. The silence is finally being broken. And in that space, there's a chance for a new kind of history, one based on truth, respect, and justice. If you found this exploration of a hidden history valuable, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into the stories that shape our world. And to understand another facet of colonial legacies, watch our next video. Thank you very much for watching. Did you know about the horrors that happened in Australia? Leave your comments down below. I'm Josh, and this is The Villainous Vault. Thanks again.